εδώ στην Αθήνα και καλημέρα σε όλους online. Καλώς ήρθατε στην Αμερικανική Σχολή Κλασικών Σπουδών. Welcome to the American School of Classical Studies at Athens. My name is Brendan Burke, and I am the Andrew W. Mellon Professor of Classical Studies. I have the honor tonight of standing in for our director, Jennifer Niles, to introduce our speaker, Dr. Nigel Kennell. Dr. Kennell is one of our two Elizabeth Whitehead Distinguished Scholars in residence this academic year, and we and our student members especially are very fortunate to have him as an addition to our academic program. He brings great depth and breadth to our trips and to our on-site discussions. Our other Whitehead professor, Dr. Teresa Shawcross, will be speaking next month in this venue on December 2nd on Episcopal charity and justice in Middle Byzantine Greece, and we're very much looking forward to that. Our speaker tonight, Dr. Kennell, is a well-known figure in Athens and throughout Greece, especially in Sparta. He took his BA from the University of British Columbia, an MA and PhD from the University of Toronto. He was a regular member of the American School in 1978 and 79, a year which produced very many distinguished scholars, among which he is great company. Beginning in the 1980s and through the 1990s, Dr. Kennell moved up the ranks to Professor of Classics at Memorial University of Newfoundland. The new millennium brought the Kennells back to Athens, and from 2000 to 2002, he served as director of the Canadian Archaeological Institute at Athens, now the Canadian Institute in Greece. His wife, Dr. Stephanie Kennell, also served as director of the Canadian Institute, as did I. Anybody else? From 2003 to 2012, he taught for college year in Athens and was a senior member of the ASCSA and a very active member of the intellectual community here in Greece. Upon returning to Canada, he taught for the Department of Classical, Near Eastern, and Religious Studies at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver, Canada, where he is also an honorary research member and a member of the managing committee of the American School, a representative from UBC. His career-long interests in Spartan history and Greek civic institutions, especially the training of citizens in the Hellenistic and Roman periods, established his reputation as one of the leading figures in this field. As such, in 2019, he was appointed by the American School to direct a summer seminar he devised called Finding the Spartans. Dr. Kennell has been a research assistant and visiting member at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, a research associate of the Collège de France in Paris, and a visiting fellow of All Souls College, Oxford. He has authored the books The Gymnasium of Virtue, Education and Culture in Ancient Sparta, Ephebes, a register of Greek cities and citizen training in the Hellenistic and Roman periods, and Spartans, A New History, 2010 through Wiley-Blackwell. With Jonathan Tomlinson, he co-edited Ancient Greece at the turn of the millennium, marking 25 years for the Canadian Institute in Athens. And while here at the school, he will be focused on a project entitled New Approaches to the Greek Ephebes. This scholarly interest and in the gymnasium and Greek citizen training systems will inform his winter seminar with the regular members. It will also be part of his presentation tonight, which is entitled Leading the Spirits of Youth to Excellence, Greek Citizen Training in Context. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Nigel Kennell.
Are these on? Are they on? Ah, yes. Thank you very much, Brendan, for your fulsome introduction. I would just like to get myself some water first of all. Κυρίες και κύριοι, είναι ιδιαίτερη χαρά να παρουσιάσω απόψε στο Κότσον Χολ της Αμερικανικής Σχολής Κλασικών Σπουδών. Εγώ και 43 χρόνια η σχολή ωφελούσε τις έρευνες μου, τα δημοσιεύματα μου και όχι μόνο. Για περισσότερα από μία δεκαετία, εγώ και η Στεφανία, η γυναίκα μου, κάναμε το σπίτι μας στην Αθήνα. Εδώ βρίσκονται οι πολλοί φίλοι μας, Έλληνες και ξένοι. Εδώ είναι όντως η δεύτερη πατρίδα μας, η ωραία Ελλάδα. Ως μικρή ανανταστάθμιση, μιλάω τώρα για ένα θέμα που μόλις πρόσφατα προσέλκυσε την προσοχή των μελετητών. Πώς οι αρχαίοι Έλληνες μεταμόρφωναν τα αγόρια σε πολίτες. Τώρα πρέπει να συνεχίσω στα αγγλικά. On August the 11th, 1877, the following item appeared in the London periodical The Academy. A collection of antiquities belonging to Mr. Frank Calvert of the Dardanelles was sold at Sotheby's on Thursday the 2nd instant. The most important items were acquired for the British Museum and include 1, a bronze weight in the form of a lion found at Abydos, and 2, a marble slab with Greek inscription of 106 lines from Sestos, recording honors to a certain Minas. Frank Calvert, well known to anyone interested in the fraught history of the discovery of Troy, was an Englishman who served as American consul in the region for many decades. He had discovered the stele in 1865, built into the wall of a mosque in the village of Yalova, and had it removed for the collection of antiquities at his mansion, Thimbra Farm, across the Hellespont. It was first mentioned in the 1865 volume of the Journal of the Archaeological Institute, not our institute in America, and attracted scholars from Western Europe to this part of Turkey to study the text. Among the first to publish a study of the object in the 1873 number of the journal Hermes was Karl Curtius, first cousin once removed of the more famous Ernst. An impressive artifact, over 1.5 meters tall, varying in width from 69 centimeters to 59 centimeters as it tapers upwards, like many such stelae, and 13 centimeters thick, the stone slab bears an inscription recording honors bestowed by the council and people of Sestos on the Hellespont at a date between 133 and 120 BCE, on one Minas, son of Menes, for his services to the city during a particularly stressful period in the later 2nd century. His early career had been marked by embassies to the Attalid kings, consistently successful if we are to believe the text, and good relations with the local military governor. The end of the royal dynasty at the death of Attalus III brought instability, a time of critical danger, in the words of the inscription, when the city was gripped by fear of attack by Thracian tribes and the sudden outbreak of unrest caused by the rebel Aristonicus, who contested Attalus III's bequeathal of all Pergamene territory to the Romans. During the conflict, Minas used his diplomatic skills with Roman generals and ambassadors to ensure Sestos' safety and establish good relations with other peoples who had suffered in the war against the pretender. At home, he held a high-profile position as priest of Attalus and was put in joint charge of introducing bronze coinage to Sestos when the people decided that the city's coin type should be used as a current type and the people should receive the profit resulting from this source of revenue. His conduct in other offices and liturgies, whose expenditures he would have been expected to subsidize with his own money, was equally blameless, though the Sestians did not think them worthy of individual mention. Minas's 2 tenures of one particular post were another matter. 45 of the inscription's 106 lines, about 43% of the text, are devoted to his service as gymnasiarch, the magistrate who administered the training of citizens, usually in a gymnasium. In his first year, Minas went further than simply maintaining discipline among his young charges, but built a bathhouse and adjoining building. At the monthly celebrations of the royal Attalid birthday, Minas held sacrifices on behalf of the people and put on contests for the youth in the gymnasium. He also oversaw competitions in javelin and archery and generously distributed unguent. The people recognized his efforts to urge the youth on to exercise and diligence by allowing him to communicate his deeds in inscriptions. When the people invited him to hold the office again, Sestos was once more struggling in the toils of war. Rapacious attacks by Thracians had laid the land waste, rendering it infertile. And even though Minas suffered much himself, he undertook the expenses of the gymnasiarchy and assumed office at the new year. As before, he sacrificed to Hermes and Heracles, gods of the gymnasium, held races and other competitions in javelin throwing and archery, inviting everyone possible to the sacrifices, both citizen and foreigner. These contests and sacrifices continued each month, with Minas distributing the victims' meat among the youth. Minas' zeal was such, as we are told in recognizably Aristotelian terms, as to propel the young towards exercise and diligence, out of which youthful spirits, by contending for manliness, are well led by habit to excellence. He also allowed the meat to be taken home, thus benefiting even more people with his generosity. He brought in intellectuals to improve his charges' education. He provided extra strigils and unguent. At the annual festival for Hermes and Heracles, he paid for the prize shields in all events and financed their inscription and dedication in the gymnasium. Unusually, he also presented second prizes and even held contests for boys, not usual thing for a gymnasiarch. Minas even paid for the awards in combat sports and the long-distance race for the older youth. He assessed his charges' qualities in disciplined behavior, diligence, and physique. And he crowned his tenure with a bumper sacrifice to which he invited everyone who exercised in the gymnasium and foreigners who qualified for entry. For this, the Cestians and the various categories of youth in the gymnasium honored him with crowns, official announcements in the games, good seats in the theater for him and his descendants, and a bronze statue to be erected in the gymnasium, which with characteristically prominent generosity he paid for himself. Why did the Cestians devote so much of the space on this stone, and I so much time in this talk, too much time some of you may think, to the activities of an official in charge of a system of training that had declined into a sporting association and philosophical school reserved for the jeunesse dorée, as Chrysis Pelakides described the latest system at Athens, and whose curriculum substituted for real knowledge a frivolous, superficial smattering of knowledge that was no more than a caricature of any genuine humanism, in the words of Henri-Irénée Marot, the great historian of ancient education. To answer, we need to explore the nature of the office held by Minas, the gymnasiarchy, and of the system he administered. Derived from gymnasia, training, and archein, to hold office, gymnasiarchos denotes the official in charge of young men's training. The gymnasiarch was the magistrate presiding over the gymnasium, its administration, as well as the discipline and well-being of its users. Gymnasiarchs were in charge of the provision of olive oil, which was used in preparation for exercise. Generosity was a much praised virtue as well, as in this funeral relief for a gymnasiarch depicting an athlete taking his ration from a large vat of oil. Oil was expensive, whether imported or produced locally, had to be purchased by the city for distribution. In the 2nd century CE, the Phrygian city of Apamea spent some 34,000 denarii on oil for the gymnasium. In some, perhaps most cities, this cost was defrayed by selling the daily oil allowance to participants. Gymnasiarchs might be praised for subsidizing the supply by selling it at a discount, and on occasion generously giving the oil away. Although the Cestian gymnasium had a formal distribution of oil, an alema, no such benefaction is mentioned in the decree from Minas, which may indicate that despite its difficulties, the city still had robust enough finances to ensure a steady supply, or that Minas' own estates were among the most of the land that had been rendered fruitless by Thracian raids. Gymnasiarchs are known at Athens from as early as the 5th century. But the Athenian office was a competitive tribal liturgy whose holder was only expected to fund teams in training for torch relay races. Elsewhere, the gymnasiarch was the gymnasium's chief administrator, responsible for maintaining order and discipline among its users, as Aristotle noted. The earliest explicit evidence for gymnasiarchs comes from Kamiros on Rhodes and Pherae, where locals returning from campaign with Alexander in Asia probably built a gymnasium and established the gymnasiarchy in 330-29, as the restored part of this text says. A few decades later, the people of Caresia on Chios used their new festival as an excuse to establish an annual gymnasiarchy to supervise the training of the young. The training at these places and later at Sestos and many other cities was carried out within the context of an institution called the ephebia, or ephebate, through which young freeborn males with the correct qualifications passed before becoming fully fledged citizens. The ephebate was ubiquitous in the Greek world, explicitly attested in, at my last count, 190 Greek cities, from southern France to Afghanistan, and spanning more than 700 years from the early 4th century BCE to the mid-4th CE. Despite its ubiquity, however, the ephebate has only recently become the subject of extensive academic scrutiny due to a compelling narrative of its decline in the Hellenistic period that was the product of misinterpretation of the evidence for the best attested ephebia, that of Athens. Athens was the home to the earliest known ephebate, in the strict sense of a permanent, discrete, public institution whereby youths underwent military training together at a legally established age. Sometime between 383 and 373 BCE, the Athenians instituted a program of training and recruiting most young citizens into military service. As a title for the recruits into this training system, the Athenians coined a new term, ephebos, ephebe, equivalent to the English cadet. Originally, ephebes served for 2 years in their 19th and 20th years. The first they spent in barracks in the Piraeus, where instructors taught them weapons handling, archery, javelin throwing, and how to use the newly invented catapult. In the second year, the young men were assigned to patrol the countryside and man fortresses. By the beginning of the 3rd century, however, the term of service had been reduced to 1 year and was no longer expected of most Athenians, probably due to budgetary constraints. This is understandable, since the 4th century ephebia may have cost the city as much as 60 talents per annum. Therefore, thereafter, so the consensus has long agreed, the Athenian ephebate lost its military purpose and increasingly resembled an institution of higher learning as the emphasis shifted from military training to education in the liberal arts. Though some weapons training was kept up right into the Roman period, the later ephebate was never anything more than a shadow of its former self. Luckily, this view of the history of the Athenian ephebate and citizen training systems elsewhere has undergone a radical readjustment as it becomes increasingly evident that far from declining into a form of aristocratic finishing school during the Hellenistic period, the ephebate continued to perform the vital function of training young citizen warriors for civic defense forces. This evening I'd like to present a new picture of this fascinating and important institution that may, I hope, help to explain why the people of Sestos thought their fellow citizen Minas worthy of such honors. Principally, I must emphasize the ephebia's continuing military role. That role has long been misunderstood, with the result that our interpretation of the evidence has become distorted. After reforms in the early 330s established the Athenian ephebate in its fully developed form, as attested in the Constitution of Athens, written probably by a student of Aristotle, ephebes in their second year of service, when they were 19 years old in modern terms, spent their time either posted in border garrisons or as patrols in the countryside, where they presumably dealt with any threat to life, property, or Athenian sovereignty. Epigraphical evidence shows that some ephebes were regularly stationed at the fort of Rhamnus in northeast Attica. By the end of the 4th century, ephebes no longer played a continuing active military role due to changes in Athens' training program. But this does not mean that people of ephebic age had no military role at all. In its earliest stage, the Athenian ephebate had been fully incorporated into that city's military institutions. Upon entering the ephebate, a young Athenian also became a member of one of 42 age classes, Hellenistic, in which he remained throughout the years he was liable for conscription. Although the ephebia changed in the last decades of the 4th century, the need for citizen soldiers did not evaporate overnight, nor, as far as we know, did conscription by military age class. During the later periods of Athenian independence, young Athenians would still have manned the border fortresses, Rhamnus among them, but now as fully fledged soldiers rather than as ephebic cadets. And throughout the 3rd century, ephebes themselves were called on to aid the city in emergencies, still leaving on expeditions into the countryside, when needed. Beyond the borders of Attica, other cities soon followed the Athenian lead. The earliest solid evidence for ephebes comes from Eretria, a city with close ties to Athens, where they appear in a document dated to between 315 and 305. However, a local tradition in Alexandria in Egypt, attested under Hadrian, assigned the origin of their ephebet to Alexander the Great himself. If true, as the author of the most comprehensive institutional study of the Hellenistic ephebet has suggested, evidence for the Macedonian king's foundation would antedate the Eretrian by some 15 years, making the Egyptian city the first after Athens to have an attested ephebet. The first half of the 3rd century also sees the beginning of a series of catalogues from cities in Boeotia, which continues into the 2nd century BCE, recording the accession of year classes of ephebes into the Boeotian army, a sign of the ephebet's ongoing, continuing military role. In Asia Minor, too, at Ilium, Miletus, and Teos, the first references to ephebes appear between 300 and 250 BC. Clearly, by this time, the institution had already become widespread throughout the Greek world. Traditional maturation practices in many cities were gradually transformed into Hellenistic-style citizen training systems. Perhaps the clearest indication of this phenomenon is that traditional names sometimes survived in the Hellenistic period for the young men enrolled in ephebets. For example, the Triakatioi at Cyrene, the Agalaioi at Dreros on Crete, the Triaterines in Messene and Thuria, Nymphioi on Mykonos, and the Scythai of Elis. Similarly, Samians called youths in the year before their ephebic service, who elsewhere might be melepheboi, future ephebes, palekes. Among the survivals, there were also revivals and inventions. The best example of this phenomenon is found at Sparta, where in the 3rd century BCE, Cyrus the Stoic philosopher drew on local tradition to devise a Laconian-style ephebet for Cleomenes III called the Agoge, which provided a pool of highly motivated, well-trained ex-ephebes for the king's fearsomely effective citizen army. Their loyalty to the king and his program to revive Spartan military greatness would have been strengthened by the archaizing names of the ephebic age grades in which they served: Rhobidai, Promykizomenoi, Mykizomenoi, Propaides, Paides, Melerenes, and Erenes. These ephebes, like their predecessors in supposedly warlike classical Sparta, did not normally play an active role in military affairs. The infamous Crypteia, in which helots were arbitrarily murdered, had been for Hebontes, all above the age of maturity. Instead, ephebes at Sparta and everywhere else trained. Only at Athens, for a brief period of 3 decades in the 4th century, is there evidence for ephebes patrolling the countryside and manning garrisons as part of their regular duties. All other cities utilize young ex-ephebes aged 20 to approximately 30 for this task. Still, as a recent book on the Athenian ephebet in the Hellenistic period has shown, ephebes there continued to train exclusively in military skills until the 2nd century BCE, sometimes making excursions into the countryside as ordained by decrees of the council and people. On Lesbos, the gymnasiarch of Erissos was praised for leading the youths and anyone else who wished on an excursion to the borders of the city's territory. The commander of the ephebes at Amphipolis was required to lead his charges out on day-long sorties at least once a month. Like Athenian youths, ephebes elsewhere underwent training in the traditional weapons of the hoplite and light-armed soldier: weapons handling, hoplomachia, archery, javelin throwing. At Sestos, Minas held contests in archery and the javelin in both his terms as gymnasiarch, while also putting on diadromai, contests in a variety of military subjects, and holding a legally required race in arms and parade, the Euandria, at the end of his year. In his 2nd year, he also added weapons as prizes for the long-distance race and tests of the military qualities of discipline, eutaxia, diligence, philoponia, and physical conditioning, euexia. Cities richer than Sestos, might follow Athens' lead and provide instruction in the catapult. Its importance for civil defense can be gauged from the fact that at Kos, the city's generals presided over the contests in the catapult, not the gymnasiarch, while the Samians every month tested their young men's proficiency with the normal bolt-firing catapult, the oxybeles, as well as with the more specialized stone-throwing version called the lithobolos. They evidently considered experience in artillery so crucial that boys began to receive instruction even before they entered the ephebes. The chief magistrates of Caressia were charged with keeping the catapults the ephebes used in readiness and well supplied with bolts. This training in various types of weapons, as well as the competitions in the martial qualities of discipline, diligence, and good physique, were far more than mere window dressing. The gymnasium itself was part of a city's military infrastructure, and the military training of their youth was a necessity for cities hoping to navigate the hostile waters of Hellenistic geopolitics. The gymnasium was the center of a city's military training. However, the ephebes who trained there were called to active duty only in case of emergencies, as at Athens during the Cremonaidean War and at Cretan Dreros, where graduating ephebes stated that they were defending their land against the Meletians in the later 3rd century BCE. Mark Antony's navy was so short-handed before the Battle of Actium that his captains pressed ephebes into service, a quite unusual event. Thus, at Cyzicus, Theopethes, an 18-year-old whose posthumous statue his proud father dedicated to Isis and Serapis after he had died fighting against a murderous phalanx, must have fought as a member of an ephebic contingent called up in an emergency in the 2nd or 1st century BCE. On the other hand, a city's domestic security detail, which patrolled the countryside and enforced the borders, was drawn from the other main group who frequented the gymnasium, the young men, or neoi, who were 20 to about 30 years old. Very often, the term Neoiskoi, our boys, appears in inscriptions denoting a city's local military forces, as a text from Apollonia Salbaces in Caria recording the dedication of the new Parthenon attests, in which the act is done by the commander of the Neoiskoi, the Neoiskakes, Papias, son of Eutychus, along with the Neoiskoi themselves, and Stephanion, the city's paraphylax, the magistrate charged with domestic security. A decree from Araxa in Lycia honors a citizen sent out at the head of the Neoiskoi to suppress an incipient tyranny at Xanthus in 180 BCE. A century later, the people of Ilion honored Nicander from Poimanenon, since when the proconsul Gaius Claudius Nero ordered the magistrates of the Poimanenines to dispatch soldiers for us for the protection of the city and a commander for them, he, that is Nicander, caused the stationing of the Neoiskoi under his command to be orderly and blameless. When the Cyrenaica was plunged into crisis upon the death of Ptolemy Apion, Berenike honored Apollodorus, son of Pancrates, because immediately after the king's death, with Berenike under no small siege by evildoers because of the existing anarchy, having been called upon to lead the Neoiskoi, he established affairs in the greatest peace. In Ptolemaic Egypt, the Neoiskoi evidently formed a separate class of young soldiers who were charged with police duties and participated in municipal life much in the manner of their counterparts elsewhere. This usage is not confined to the epigraphical evidence, for the historian Polybius frequently uses Neoiskoi or simply neoi to describe civic troops. The armed forces of Sparta are mentioned several times as neoi, while those of Tarentum Polybius consistently styles Neoiskoi. The precise nature of the word becomes clear when the forces member cities contributed to the Achaean and Aetolian leagues appear as Neoiskoi. In fact, he makes an explicit distinction between civic troops and mercenaries when he describes the incompetence of an Achaean general in 218-217 BC as being so profound that he was despised by the civic troops, hupo ton politikon Neoiskon, and thoroughly discredited in the eyes of the professionals, hupoton mistophoron. A decree from Metropolis in Ionia, authorizing the erection of a statue to a commander of the Neoiskoi, Apollonius, killed in action, shows how the terms neoi and Neoiskoi could be employed in their military and gymnasial contexts. Before his fateful election as commander of the Neoiskoi, as the second side of the stele records, Apollonius had played the decisive role in inducing Attalus II to endow the city with 500 drachmae yearly for the oil distribution to the Neoi in the gymnasium, as well as an equal sum for lessons for the freeborn paides. The term Neoi here comprises the two age grades, the Neoi proper and the ephebes, in contrast with the underage paides, while the Neoiskoi on the first side are precisely those members of the gymnasial community who formed the defense forces of Metropolis. While Neoi exercised in the gymnasium, sometimes alongside the ephebes, in mostly the same athletic events, their lives were apparently less regulated than those of their younger counterparts. No formal entry or exit ceremonies are attested for them, nor do we possess any lists of Neoi, in contrast to the hundreds of such catalogues of ephebes from all over the Greek East. Their dual roles as young men training in the gymnasium under the jurisdiction of a gymnasiarch and as fully fledged citizens meant that Neoi were the ephebes' senior partners and in many cities spoke on their behalf in public pronouncements. In at least one instance, this happened quite literally, when at Pergamum a group of Neoi entered a meeting of the Boulae to request that one Mithridates be honored with a gold crown and a bronze statue, testifying to their gymnasiarch's equable and just conduct in his office. Although the subsequent decree only records the intervention of the Neoi, the inscription authorized by the Boulae for the base of his statue was to refer to his supervision of the cultural education and decorum of both the ephebes and the Neoi. On the other hand, the inscription on the base of Minas' bronze statue that was to be erected in the gymnasium of Sestos would read, "The Demos and the Neoi dedicated the statue of Minas, son of Menes, who twice served as gymnasiarch well and with zeal, being a hero to the people." Here once more the Neoi stood for themselves as well as the epheboi, both the major user groups of the gymnasium. In the larger federal states and kingdoms, the gymnasium played a vital military role. Located in cities throughout the Macedonian realm, for instance, they formed a network of military training schools, providing a constant stream of new recruits for the Antigonid war machine during the Hellenistic period. And Hieron I of Syracuse in the early 3rd century BCE made the promotion of military training in the cities under his control a cornerstone of his policy in order to reduce reliance on mercenaries. At the same time, the Boeotian League's army was maintained through the annual accession into its ranks of new crops of recruits from its member cities, and the League even attempted on one occasion to impose a measure of uniformity on military instruction throughout its territory. Although most surviving evidence concerns matters of discipline, finances, the organization of festivals, and the all-important need for oil, the gymnasiarch's military role can be glimpsed from time to time. The gymnasiarch of Coressia was required to supervise thrice-monthly compulsory ephebic training in archery, javelin, and the catapult. In the festival ending his year, the victors won practical prizes: quivers of arrows, helmets, shields, and the heads and shafts of spears, which had to be ready for subsequent inspection by the city's generals. A gymnasiarch at Saluntum in Sicily led a force of ephebes and citizen soldiers on campaign in the later Hellenistic period. This military connection gave the gymnasium a decidedly martial air, with officials such as the gymnasiarch sometimes being ranked with army officers, while military terminology was often used in gymnasial contexts. The connection was sometimes reflected in iconography, as on the 1st century BC sarcophagus of the gymnasiarch Ariston and his wife Gygaea from Chalcedon, where representations of his cuirass, helmet, and greaves are placed right beside those of utensils from the gymnasium: bell, ball, oil vat, palm frond, and victory wreaths. Good behavior and discipline, eutaxia, were expected of those frequenting the gymnasium. When Minas was first chosen gymnasiarch, he took thought for the eutaxia of the epheboi and the Neoi, and at the Hermaia festival gave weapons as prizes for eutaxia, physical conditioning, diligence, and Philipponia, the same events as in the Hermaia at Berea, whose gymnasiarchic law has a recognizably military tenor. Of the qualities prized in the gymnasium, discipline, eutaxia, was essential for warriors fighting together as a military unit. At the end of the 3rd century, the engineer and writer Philo Mechanicus recommended that in times of siege, squads of hoplites and light-armed troops be kept in readiness by a city's outer defenses so that they can swiftly and with good discipline obey their officers' orders to set fire to the enemy's war machines. In a modern army too, discipline is paramount. As in the Commission for a British Army Officer serving during the First World War put it, you are at all times to exercise and well maintain discipline in arms, both the inferior officers and men serving under you, and use your best endeavours to keep them in good order and discipline. In peace, as well as war, troops and their officers were praised for orderly behaviour, since all too often the passage of even a friendly army was looked on with justifiable dread by local inhabitants. Among the orders given the commander of a royal garrison in Boeotia was that he keep himself and his soldiers in good order, eutactus. The civic troops sent from Poimeninon to Ilium were orderly and blameless in their behaviour, according to the decree honouring their leader. During the period of Aetolian hegemony, the Delphians praised two Messenian commanders for keeping their soldiers orderly and without reproach. The military value of ephebic eutaxia becomes clear in a decree passed when Athens was in the grip of the Chremonidean War, in which the ephebes of 267 were praised for conducting themselves in a disciplined manner in all their guard duties and defence of Museum Hill. In addition to keeping order, usually through corporal punishment, gymnasiarchs like Minas were supposed to take positive measures for the moral and cultural improvement of the citizens in training. Although a strenuous program of physical exercise and competition was considered the most efficient way to inculcate values into a city's youth, for example, Minas was praised for holding contests in various events so that he turned his charges by means of competitive spirit towards exercise and diligence, from which things the souls of youth, as they strive for courage, are well led by force of habit towards excellence. Even so, experts in the humanities were essential. In fact, Minas is described immediately afterwards as behaving beneficently to all those who came to give special lectures, akroases, wishing even in this way to cloak his country in renown by means of men of culture, and so took thought for the education, the paideia, of the Neoi and ephebes. An inscription from roughly the same period as Minas provides a tiny glimpse of the form this education might take. In it, the Cestian Neoi, ephebes, paides, and instructors, the paideutai, record their awarding of a crown to Asclepiades, the geometry instructor, the geometres. Plutarch mentions Athenian ephebes learning geometry in his day and describes geometrai using tangible aids to teach shapes like spheres, cubes, and dodecahedrons to pupils who cannot yet grasp such abstract concepts, by which he must be referring to children, paides. At Sestos, Asclepiades would have also adjusted the content of his lectures to match the capabilities of his audience, for which he was suitably rewarded. At Hellenistic Athens, attendance at classes and lectures given by the city's famed intellectuals was a regular part of the ephebic curriculum. There, ephebes were fortunate enough to be able to take advantage of whole courses of study, scholae, given by the philosophers and other academics resident in their city. Elsewhere, occasional lectures, akroases, the word used at Sestos, were the norm. These were sometimes given by travelling scholars who happened to visit, such as Asclepiades. On occasion, these experts were hired directly by the gymnasiarch himself, as when Mantidoras brought a Homeric philologist from Athens to Eretria for the edification of the ephebes and paides, or when Zosimus, Plini's most distinguished gymnasiarch, provided his ephebes with a grammar teacher for literary studies. Their fees might be partially paid from a common gymnasial fund, such as evidently existed at Pergamum, where two gymnasiarchs made additional payments to lecturers out of their own pockets, above and beyond the contributions of the Neoi. At other times, scholars might themselves supplement the income they received from the gymnasial authorities. The peripatetic philosopher Epicrates gained Samian citizenship at the end of the 2nd century for giving the city's youth the benefit of his learning and for teaching free of charge those people who could not pay the fee set by him, which may imply that his fees for teaching the Neoi had already been paid. A Pagaean doctor received praise from his hometown for useful lectures on public health he gave in the gymnasium. At Boeotian Haliartus, a Macedonian philosopher presented a successful series of lectures to the ephebes. The content of any lecture or course they gave on the gymnasium's premises, whatever the source of payment, had to meet with the gymnasiarch's approval. Philosophers whose thought was not considered conducive to the moral welfare of citizen training could expect to be ejected bodily from the gymnasium or even flogged. In one anecdote, a gymnasiarch even commanded the philosopher Carneades to lower his voice during a particularly loud discussion. Generally speaking, education in what we would call the liberal arts was associated with the age group younger than the ephebes, the adolescents called paides, boys. For them, a mixture of physical and mental training could be provided, well illustrated by the case of the paidonomos, the gymnasiarch's equivalent for paides from the village of Haidai near Milasa, who often set up fitting prizes for the paides for the contests held in the palaestra of diadromai, wrestling, boxing, and pankration. He similarly set up prizes for the quizzes in reading, calligraphy, and general knowledge. The distinction also appears in a victor's list from Chios, dating to the 1st century BCE. In a gymnasial contest sacred to the Muses and Heracles, the ephebes and neoi only competed in the athletic competitions, the long-distance race, the stayed race, wrestling, and boxing. The paides, in addition to these events, also entered competitions in reading, anagnosis, rhapsodia, and singing, psalmos. At some cities, paides were gradually introduced to military training as preparation for entering the ephebet. One of the clearest examples of this phenomenon is found at Teos, where a lengthy inscription from the 2nd century BCE details the provisions of a bequest by Polythroos, son of Anasimos, to fund the education of the 3 children. According to Polythroos' instructions, the boys and girls were to have teachers of basic literacy, grammatodidaskaloi, while the 2 eldest year classes of paides, along with the ephebes, received instruction in music from a kithara instructor, a kitharistes, or singing coach, a psaltes, and in archery and javelin from a hoplomachos and a specialist instructor. The Tians' insistence on facility with the kithara is probably connected to Dionysus, their city's mythic founder, whose patronage was evident in a miraculous fountain of wine, and to the presence of the guild of Dionysiac artists, who made Teos their headquarters in the 3rd century. Tian ambassadors at Priansos on Crete sang the ancient poems of Timotheus to the kithara, and the kithara appears so often on coins of Teos that it has been suggested that music was the most important aspect of the god's cult there. In the hands of a Tian ephebe, the kithara linked that future citizen with the city's primordial founder, and of course with Teos' most famous son, the poet Anacreon, whose vivid songs were accompanied by the kithara. Such evocations of the past are so well attested in citizen training systems all over the Mediterranean and beyond that there can be little doubt that ephebes at Sestos were also exposed to exemplary figures and events from local mythology and history, even though the decree for Minas mentions none. From the beginning, ephebes were incorporated into the web of their city's history. A stele erected near Athens in the later 4th century contained the oath of the ephebes, along with the text of what purports to be an oath sworn by the Athenians before the Battle of Plataea. In addition, the crowning relief on the top of the stele represents the clothing and weaponry of the young ephebe and adult hoplite soldier. The entire assemblage thus reflects the emerging ethos of the Athenian ephebe. The Plataean oath complemented the ephebic oath above it and implied that the ephebes were themselves heirs of the warriors who fought for Greece's freedom over a century before. This set an influential ideological template for ephebic training that survived well into the Roman period and the decline of hoplite tactics on the battlefield. In the Hellenistic period, Athenian ephebes continued to participate in activities evoking the city's past military achievements, putting on a display under arms and crowning the collective tomb, the polyandrion, in the Keramikos during the Epitaphia festival, traveling annually to Marathon to honor the fallen, journeying to Oropos, now in Boeotian hands, to assert Athens' historical claims to the territory. The extant territory is widespread and indicates that memory of the past, both historical and mythical, constituted an important part in the training of young citizens more or less everywhere. For example, Argive ephebes trained beside the grave of Kilarabes, the city's first king, in a gymnasium named after him, while at Epidaurus the ephebic gymnasium was the Lykion, its Apolline connotations intrinsic to a city protected by Asclepius. And the mythic history was evoked at Troezen through the Hippolytean gymnasium, whose youthful associations were appropriate to young citizens in training. An interconnected set of events also evoked remembrance at Tanagra, according to the travel writer Pausanias, where locals told of Hermes Creophoros removing plague from the city by carrying a ram around the city and its walls, in commemoration of which the artist Calamis fashioned a statue of the god with a ram on its shoulders. During the Roman period, whichever ephebe was judged the most handsome was to carry a lamb around the city at the Hermaia, the quintessential gymnasial festival. The Hermes whose temple provided Pausanias with the impetus for his account was called Promachos, because when a hostile fleet from nearby Eretria landed on the city's territory, the god himself appeared wielding the ephebes' implement, the slenges, the strigil, and led the Tanagrans to victory. Local myth also formed the framework for ephebic events elsewhere. On Zakynthos, events in a contest attached to a communal sacrifice to Aphrodite culminated in a foot race for ephebes, whose winner was the first to enter her temple, where Aeneas and the Trojans had sacrificed while it was under construction. Dionysius of Halicarnassus termed this the race of Aeneas and Aphrodite. The complex eddies and currents in the development of each city's individual ephebic ideology are now impossible to trace, but it is becoming clear that training systems, in addition to inculcating a sense of the past, evolved to meet local needs, taking on more purely educational content in some cases, or in others concentrating on a military function. Admission to an ephebia might be restricted to the elite by the setting of a property qualification, like that of Amphipolis, or might be more open, as at Pergamum, where the late 2nd century BCE Gymnasia Metrodorus was praised for his treatment of all his charges, both those of the lowest station and the upper class. Ephebiae might be tools of social exclusion, as in Egypt, where a Hellenic ancestry had to be proven for would-be ephebes, or they might even be the means of Hellenization, as shown by the presence of Jews in ephebic lists from Coronea in Messenia, Iassos, Syrian Antioch, and Cyrene, where 4 Jewish ephebes, Barthebas, son of Barthebas, Eleazar and Agathocles, the sons of Eleazar, and the enthusiastic Kyrias, son of Judas, are listed in catalogues dedicated to Hermes and Heracles, despite Judaism's revulsion at idolatry. While the ephebet took a variety of styles, the core subjects in which young citizens-to-be were trained remained remarkably consistent throughout the centuries of its existence and over the vast extent of its geographical reach. The javelin, bow, arms handling, and where circumstances permitted, the catapult, remained at the heart of citizen training. So constant were these elements of the curriculum in the institution's very structure that they might themselves transmit collective social memory, as well as any reenactment of ancient myth. In 110 BCE, the Greek community in Arsacid Babylon held contests for their ephebes and neoi. Although the medium in which they chose to record that year's victors was a Babylonian clay tablet, like the one shown here, the text is impossible, the actual object is impossible to find. It's lost in a private collection for almost 100 years. The events they competed in had a distinctly old-fashioned military and, importantly, Hellenic flavor. Archery, javelin, the hoplites hollow shield, the oblong shield, long distance, and stayed races. Here, in a city where relations between those who had claimed a Hellenic identity since the establishment of a polity under Antiochus IV, sometime after 172-1 BCE, and the indigenous Babylonians were punctuated by outbreaks of intercommunal violence, training in such disciplines enabled ephebes to assert their separate Greco-Macedonian identity. The events at Babylon would not have been out of place in an ephebic contest in a contemporary city of the Greek mainland, or even in later centuries. The Greek gymnasium's deep conservatism was the source of its abiding cultural influence throughout the Hellenistic and Roman periods. Participation in the ancient exercises attested at such places as Babylon, Cyrene, Samos, Cnidus, Erythrae, Kuenae, Chalkis, Berea, Amphipolis, and Sestos asserted the ephebes' Greek identity, while providing a conceptual space for remembrance and participation in the collective cultural memory of each community, whether in the south of France, the Ukraine, Syria, or the Peloponnese. While if ephebes trained in traditional military exercises and took part in cultic ceremonies all over the world, in liminal locations where Hellenic culture met with active opposition, like Gorgippia in Sarmatia, Babylon, or even Sestos, their years in ephebic service would have been put to practical use upon graduation. At Sestos, the Neoi who had trained under Minas would have been expected to keep the Thracians at bay and to defend their city in the confusion surrounding the Romans' establishment of the province of Asia. The need for young ex-ephebes to defend their cities did not fade even with the establishment of Roman rule, especially in the borderlands, as proven by the example of Amphipolis itself, whose gymnasium was destroyed in the mid-1st century BCE, probably by Thracians. Detachments of young citizens might also fight alongside Roman armies, like the Neoiskoi of Metropolis, who under Apollonius, their ex-gymnasiarch, joined with legions under a succession of generals sent against Aristonicus. I've mentioned how Mark Antony, in his desperation before Actium, forcibly recruited ephebes to his side. But even during the empire, Romans regularly called on Greek cities for military aid. The people of Trapezus sent lightly armed soldiers as part of an allied contingent to aid against the Alans during the reign of Hadrian. And later in the century, several reliefs and inscriptions attest to the participation of young Spartans in Roman campaigns in the late 2nd and early 3rd centuries. Interestingly, they are shown wearing the uniform and weaponry of the domestic security forces as diogmetai, which may well have been their function before they were called up. However, the best later evidence for a levy of Neoi comes in the form of an honorific inscription from the reign of Marcus Aurelius, which gives the names of 80 young men from Thespiae, who along with their doctor had set off to join the most fortunate and pious campaigns of Marcus Aurelius against Germanic tribes across the Danube. In recompense for their participation, the new soldiers received the honors of council members, which the parents of the Neoi would enjoy immediately after their son's departure from the city. Pictorial imagery might reflect this phenomenon. On the top of a stele bearing the list of Athenian ephebes from the reign of Antoninus Pius, a relief depicts the year's bearded director of ephebes, the Cosmetes, crowned and in full Roman-style military dress, complete with cingulum militare, carrying a sheathed sword and holding a spear. To the left stands a naked ephebe with a chlamys over his right shoulder and a round hoplite shield on his left arm. To the right is another ephebe, in Roman armor like the Cosmetes, but carrying a libation vessel. The relief conveys two messages. The first, that the ephebes combined physical excellence, military prowess, and respect for the gods. The second, through the weaponry of the Cosmetes and the ephebes, that the ephebets' classically inspired hoplite training still contributed to the practical military needs of the city and of the empire. Even into the 3rd century CE, levies of Neoi still took place. Indeed, we can imagine that they became more common as the empire was buffeted by severe threats, both internal and external. During the later 270s and 280s in Pisidia, a Roman dux, Aurelius Ursio, ordered the dispatch of a select band of young men, of Neoiskoi epilectoi, from Termessus to deal with brigands who had seized the city of Cremna. But the increasingly assertive role taken by the Roman army in dealing with internal security would have weakened one of the main ideological underpinnings for the training of young citizens. When the promotion by Constantine and his successors of Christianity as the as the religion of the empire during the 4th century CE, and the growing allure of Constantinople as the new arena for elite self-promotion are taken into account, it would seem logical that the ephebic training systems tied so closely to the city and its round of sacrifices and festivals would wither away. Although scattered and sometimes circumstantial evidence from Sparta, Egypt, and a few cities in Asia Minor and the East attests to the ephebes' survival into the 4th century, it is clear that it could not long withstand the changed cultural climate. There is, nevertheless, one very late, intriguing reference to ephebes. In the early summer of 405, Synesius of Cyrene in North Africa wrote to his brother about the situation as his city prepared to meet a Berber attack. By night, I patrol the hill with the ephebes and provide respite for the people to sleep, knowing that some people are on watch for them. I also have to hand a troop of balagritai, who are mounted archers. Even though a Platonist, Synesius knew his Aristotle, so it's not surprising that he uses the technically correct term peripolo to describe his troop patrolling the hill. Similarly, it would have been completely in character for him to apply the classicizing label such as ephebes to a group of hastily assembled young citizen volunteers. Whatever the reality behind this appellation, Synesius' letter shows the abiding power of the ephebic tradition, and I have no doubt whether or not the defenders of Cyrene called themselves epheboi before they stood guard, that their future bishop made them fully aware of their role as heirs of a venerable military and athletic heritage reaching back to the acme of classical Greek civilization in the city he called Holy Athens. Thank you.
Thank you, Nigel. That was great. You'll take questions, I hope?
Of course, yes.
Yeah, maybe you can man the in-person questions, and there's some online as well.
Okay.
So let's do that. Is there the traveling mic? I'm not sure. Maybe we don't need it even if we're in the room. Any?
I see a couple.
I have a question about the gymnasium.
Yes.
How would they be recruited or chosen by the cities? And do you think there were any kind of prerequisites, either military or athletic activities, whether they're informal or formal requirements?
To be cynical, there's one requirement to be a gymnasiarch, and that is money. You have to have money. Whether gymnasiarchs were ever required to actively participate in military campaigns, I don't think so. We know that in some cases, we have references to gymnasiarchs being elected. We have other cases in which the gymnasiarchs are simply appointed, and we know of some situations in which gymnasiarchs are forced to be gymnasiarchs, simply because they have the money. A gymnasiarch was one of the most financially draining of all the liturgies in a Greek city, because you had to make sure that the oil flowed. Yes?
Do you have a sense of whether ephebes troops were effective against mercenary troops? Or, for instance, if you're training with, I guess, Hoplite-inspired tactics, or running the Hoplodromos, how that would be practically applicable against, say, Macedonian phalanx or innovations in warfare?
Nigel, if I could you sort of repeat?
Sorry. Yes, I was asked. The question is asked about the effectiveness of civic troops that have been trained in old-fashioned hoplite tactics against modern, in the ancient terms, professional, perhaps mercenary soldiers or Macedonian soldiers trained in the new phalanx style. We have so little. We have no evidence of any sort of conflict between a purely set of pure civic troops versus Macedonian troops. everybody, there's also another important difference between the gymnasial training and then the training on campaign. The gymnasial training was in many ways a sort of ideological training. Conceptually, the Greeks did believe that it gave people some sort of military skill. But I think most scholars believe that the practical skills were learned on the job.
Okay, we have some online questions as well,
Okay.
if I may. The question is, the ephebes was a city institution while the paidonomoi were private tutors. Was there a tension between them?
I'm afraid that terminology is mistaken. Paidonomoi were always magistrates of the city. I think you may be thinking of paidagogoi, who were private teachers. A paidonomos was a magistrate, a junior magistrate in charge of the paides as a corporate group in a city. So in that case, there's no tension. The paidagogoi are mentioned in one or two inscriptions, but they are definitely, when they impinge upon the content of an ephebic inscription or one of the two important laws that we have, the Beria and the Amphipolis law, they are just there to bring the paides to the gymnasium for exercise.
Okay. Okay. One more online then. They ask, can you say a word about homosociable relations among ephebes, neoi and gymnasias, perhaps encourage alla Thebes to inculcate loyalty, etc.?
Well, it was a sort of tradition that the gymnasium was a place for homoerotic interactions. We have the Greeks' attitude to this was ambivalent. People indulged in it, but officially it was very disapproved. We know from the Beria gymnasiarchical law that there are strict rules that keep the young teenage boys, the paides, away from anybody who is over 20 years old, from the neoi. Those were the classic age groups that engaged in homoerotic relations. So that did happen, as far as we know. We have enough erotic literature that works with that as a premise, but from our official documents, it is very definitely disapproved. Okay. It's considered to be a source of disruption.
Thank you. And there is great interest. And I thought this mic was on also, but I guess it isn't. So there was a request that you repeat even the questions I ask you. And let me ask one more from the online, because it came in early. The reference to Hellenistic Xippus, that he fought the Herulians with ephebes of Athens, is this a true event or is it a classicizing allusion?
I was asked about the speech of Dexippus, famously standing up against the Herulians during the Herulian invasion of Athens in the later 3rd century. There's nothing explicit in his speech or the surrounding text, or the fragmentary text that we have, that tells us that it is ephebes. It's a modern assumption among some scholars that he's referring to ephebes. I think it's more likely that it was a crowd of mixed ages, adults, people who had been out of the ephebet for a while, and people who were just finished training, or even ephebes. I do not think there's any doubt that there would have been people who had gone through ephebic training who were being addressed by Dexippus. And it's been noted by Fergus Millis many years ago that the eastern cities, on the whole, withstood barbarian attack in this period much better than the western cities. And I think it might very well be because of the military training that they had, at least some sense of it.
Thank you for an excellent talk. You kept speaking of oil and the great cost that it was for the gymnasia to produce oil for the. Would you tell people briefly what happened with that oil that you have written so graphically about?
As it was so expensive, this oil remained a marketable commodity even after it had been used. And we know, in fact, once again, the Beria Gymnasiarchical law does make reference to it, that a substance that used olive oil, once it had gone from an athlete's body onto the strigil and been extruded by an index finger from the strigil into a collective urn, that substance known as gloios was actually marketable, was saleable. We know that it could reach quite a lot of money and was used as a medicament, as an ointment. In some cases, like an ancient version of Preparation H, it also is supposed to change your hair color. If you want to go from black hair to blonde, you can use it, put it on overnight, and it will make your hair go white, probably. And Pliny also claims that it cures cancer. He's actually seen it cure a cancerous sore. There were grades of it. Boys, gloios was the best. And it seems to have just been one of these side products of the gymnasial culture. The gymnasium we always think of as we often think of many things from antiquity as being clean and white. The gymnasium was actually filthy. We are told that the punishment of going and cleaning the gymnasium was only a little bit better than being condemned to the mines. Yes.
Thank you for the talk. I just wanted to ask if you could explain why the bells are so prominent in those two reliefs that you showed.
Yes. The bells were one of the ways in which the gymnasiarch would indicate that the gymnasium was open and people could come and get their oil and exercise. There's another way of doing it is with a gong or a flag. Sometimes, in fact, once again, the Beria law, which if you're interested in any of this, you should actually do no better than go and get a look at it. The Beria law talks about raising of the flag. So there are many ways. And in fact, Philo Judaeus talks about, makes as an analogy between people who aren't aware of what God can do for them, and say that it's like people who come to the gymnasium too late to get their oil because it's closed. Yeah.
Okay.
I wanted to ask about the afterlife of this unique model of citizen training and its potential reception in the modern era.
Thank you. And something that immediately comes to mind is military high schools and colleges, particularly with the emphasis on great books programs and the humanities. And I was curious if you knew whether any of these institutions or their precursors invoke this tradition specifically.
I've been asked about sort of a modern reception of ephebic service. Yes, in America there is definitely almost a consciousness. Once the ephebic oath was found, there were several articles and books on how it could be applied to American education. Especially military colleges use that too. I don't know whether the founders of these military colleges had the Athenian alphabet in the front of their minds, but I shouldn't be surprised if it was somewhere in their minds. They all had a good classical education. Though, of course, we can't go back too far because what we know about the Athenian alphabet is based on the Aristotelian Athenian constitution, which wasn't discovered in Egypt until the later 19th century.
Okay. Anything else here? All right. Well, I think we should thank our speaker one more time. And for those of us in Athens, we can stay for a little bit and have a small reception downstairs. So thank you again, Nigel.